Let's kick off this explainer with a pretty startling cold open. Listen to this 1897 quote from Theodore Roosevelt. "In strict confidence, I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one." Wow, right? It's a completely wild thing to say, but it absolutely sets the stage for everything we're looking at today. Because, really, how does a country born out of an anti-colonial rebellion turn around and decide it wants a global empire? Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into the historical transition of the United States into a massive global empire, right at the turn of the 20th century. We'll be looking objectively at our source material to really decode these complex historical shifts and the hidden forces that were driving them. So here is our roadmap for today. We're hitting 6 key areas: the push for empire, markets and class war, the costs of intervention, plunder in Latin America, the imperial center, and finally, the permanent resistance. Let's jump right in. Section 1. The push for empire. Now, our main anchor text for this entire journey is Chapter 12 of Howard Zinn's classic, A People's History of the United States. The chapter is appropriately titled, The Empire and the People. And what makes Zinn's approach so compelling is that he completely flips the script. Instead of looking at history from the top down, through the eyes of presidents and diplomats, he looks at it from the bottom up. We're seeing this through the viewpoint of the everyday masses who actually lived and worked through these huge tectonic shifts. Just look at the 1890s. It's like a powder keg. We see this rapid-fire succession of events that essentially acted as the spark for overseas expansion. In 1890, the Census Bureau officially declares the internal frontier is closed. Basically, the profit system literally ran out of land to absorb. Then, bam, 1893 hits us with a brutal economic depression. And just a few years later, in 1898, the U.S. declares war on Spain and officially steps onto the global imperial stage. That brings us to Section 2, Markets and Class War. To understand why this happened, Zinn points to a really critical economic bottleneck called underconsumption. Simply put, it's a condition where a country desperately needs overseas markets to absorb its goods and relieve domestic crises. See, the working class was dealing with such low wages and harsh conditions that they literally couldn't afford to buy the massive amount of stuff they were producing. It's like a factory churning out cars that its own workers can't buy. This systemic bottleneck led straight into that severe depression in 1893, and that brought widespread strikes and some very real, very terrifying threats of open class war. So, what does the elite class do when faced with all this boiling domestic pressure? Well, they consciously chose overseas imperial expansion as the ultimate pressure release valve. By securing foreign markets and taking the profit system global, they figured out a way to safely vent all that anger of the 1890s. War and expansion suddenly became this incredibly convenient, unifying force that directed all that domestic fury outward. Moving on to Section 3. The costs of intervention. Now, to see how this actually played out on the ground, we can look at the historical data detailed by writers like Michael Parenti and Eduardo Galeano. Just look at this list. From the Philippines and Cuba over to Haiti, Honduras, Mexico, military force was used over and over again, and it was almost always pitched under this banner of providing civilizing guidance, when in reality, the source texts argue it was primarily about protecting commercial interests. And we have to talk about the human cost here, because the numbers are just staggering. Parenti points out that U.S. forces killed roughly 200,000 Filipino men, women, and children in a brutal war of attrition between 1898 and 1902. 200,000. It's a stark reminder that the actual reality of expansion is a lot messier and a lot more brutal than the clean, sanitized narratives we often get in traditional history books. Which leads us into Section 4, Plunder in Latin America. Eduardo Galeano highlights this truly startling quote from President William H. Taft in 1912. Taft said, "The whole hemisphere will be ours in fact, as, by virtue of our superiority of race, it already is ours morally." I mean, they were saying the quiet part out loud. The government was using explicit racial and imperial justifications, claiming the hemisphere was theirs morally, to give them the ideological cover they needed to dominate the entire region. And Galeano and Parenti break down exactly how that economic dominance functioned, and it's a massive imbalance. On one side, the imperial center extracts raw materials, cheap labor, and huge corporate profits. But on the flip side, what do they impose on these nations? Extreme poverty, heavy reliance on single-crop economies, and structural underdevelopment. As Galeano argues, it's a direct pipeline. The wealth of the dominating countries is quite literally fed by the poverty of the dominated ones. All right, Section 5, the Imperial Center. Now, let's bring this all back home and see how maintaining a global empire impacts the people living inside it. To do that, we're bringing in the highly influential writings of George Jackson. In his book, Blood in My Eye, which, by the way, he wrote entirely while incarcerated inside San Quentin prison, Jackson lays out a razor-sharp structural analysis of American corporatism. He spent his time inside deeply studying economics and history, and it totally transformed his perspective. Jackson argues that the U.S. functions as the ultimate imperial center. It's the place where global raw materials are shipped in and worked into finished manufactured products. But here's his critical observation. All that immense wealth, it ultimately benefits a tiny, tiny ruling class. It doesn't actually trickle down to the everyday working people who are struggling right there inside the imperial center itself. And this is where Zinn and Jackson totally align. They both note this fascinating mechanism of control. The system stabilizes this massive pyramid of wealth by creating very deliberate separate levels of oppression. Essentially, it distributes just enough wealth and privileges to just enough people to limit any real discontent to what they see as a troublesome minority. By rewarding different classes differently, based on race, sex, origin, the elite effectively keep the masses divided and fighting each other instead of the system. Finally, Section 6, the permanent resistance. So did the everyday people just take all this lying down? Absolutely not. Zinn points out a historical constant across all these sources, which was famously summed up by socialist leader Eugene Debs. It goes like this. The master class invariably declares the wars for profit and organizes the plunder. But it's the subject class, the working people, who are forced to actually go fight those battles, suffer the casualties, and ultimately, they're the ones who form the resistance against it. And that resistance has always been there, from the massive anti-imperialist league back in 1898 that fought against the Philippine War, to widespread workers' strikes, massive draft evasion, and the fierce prison organizing of people like George Jackson. Every day, marginalized people have continuously maintained what Howard Zinn beautifully describes as a permanent adversarial culture. So, we're going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on today. When you step back, look at the big picture, and examine this historical record of expansion, intervention, and extraction. Whose interests were actually being served? Does the empire ever truly benefit the people? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep questioning everything and keep exploring.